Welcome to the Center for Applied Neuroscience community and this installment of the Pop-Up Neuroscience. In today's session, we're actually going to be looking at failure and how that's interpreted in our brains. And here to guide us through the neuroscience of it all is CEO of CAN, Dr. Mandy Wintink, the intelligent, inquisitive, and infallible?
I wish. So thank you for coming and being interested or just joining in to hear about failure. There's so many different ways I can talk about this, and I actually really like talking about this topic because I think it's something that we don't often recognize as an important part of our development. And in fact, failure is a hugely important part of our development. And so what I want to do is walk you through some of those examples and take a particular approach in looking at failure from a neuroscience perspective, with the hopes of letting you realize that this is a very natural phenomenon that occurs within our biology, within our neurobiology. And in some ways, when we look at it that way, it's almost absurd to think that we would ever avoid things like failure. Anyway, so here, what I'm going to do is just screen share so I can show you some of my slides as we go along. I think this will work. Okay. So, there's several different titles for this, but the one that I'm working with right now is our brain is designed to fail, but our ego isn't. And I think that's the distinction that's really important in thinking about how our brain might be doing something, but our ego, and when I refer to ego, I'm sort of referring to our psychological state or our mind. And we'll go through that a little bit more as we continue on. So I did this at a conference that was entirely devoted to failure, and the night before I presented was the evening of when Germany had beat Brazil in the semifinal game of the World Cup, which prevented Brazil from going on into the finals. And this was a huge devastation because Brazil was hosting the World Cup, and of course they assumed that they would be in the finals. I believe they hadn't not been in the finals on their own turf for a major game in like 60 years or something like that. But what it really reminded us and gave me a lot of good content was that failure is this like excruciatingly physical, painful, and uncomfortable experience. And if you happened to be watching the game and saw what happened afterwards, you could see the devastation that was just plaguing all of the players on the Brazil team. And here's one picture of someone who's just clearly devastated by the fact that he has been on a team that failed. And it wasn't just the players who were demonstrating this incredible sense of failure and devastation, but the fans were as well. And here are just two other images of people, this boy who clearly is so upset by the fact that his team failed. And then
Sorry, Mandy, but your slides aren't actually changing.
Okay, can you see it here?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, let me just pause for a second then. Okay, what I might do.
It actually never went into, if you had been going into this slide view,
yeah,
it actually didn't do that. It actually stayed in the full view.
Okay, so can you see it now?
So it might be best to just keep it this way. This worked great.
I'll do it this way. Okay, so here's the image of failure, which is incredibly physical, painful, and uncomfortable. And this is an individual, a guy, a player from the Brazil team who's just clearly devastated. And then we can also see this when we look at the fans. So here's an image of a boy who was a fan of Brazil and he's crying over the fact that his team didn't win. And then, of course, you can see that in this woman, and I'm not even sure who that is under there, but clear devastation in the faces of people who have just witnessed the failure of their team. And what's really interesting about failure is that we see some very clear biological responses to it. So on the one hand, we have a typically have a decrease in serotonin. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that we often think of as being involved in wellness, I guess happiness, so to speak, but really it's more just sort of a sense of calmness and not feeling depressed, feeling well. We also see a reduction in testosterone. So testosterone we typically think of as a male hormone, and it is involved in aggressive acts, but we also see it being reduced in individuals who've experienced a loss, particularly those in a fight. So whether it's two alpha males fighting out to be on the top, or even two teams who are fighting it off. So we can see a decrease in serotonin and testosterone in teams who have just suffered a loss. We can also see that same decrease in fans who have actually experienced the loss of their team. So this experience is not just limited to the players, but really by observing someone else's failure, we can actually sympathize biochemically with that particular individual or that team. Of course, the reverse is also true. So here's some images of Germany who were winning or who won at the end of that game, and we would expect that they had an increase in serotonin and testosterone along with their fans as well, because we see that replicated in the literature where a winning team will show the opposite effect. So high testosterone, high serotonin. So I think we can all acknowledge that failure is can be very painful, physical, and uncomfortable. And it comes up in a lot of different places. So not just in sports, but career, life, relationships. And these are just a list of some of the ones that I've personally experienced. And I tried to restrict it to, I was going to say ones in the last little while, but they're not always. But here's some that that have hit me hard and made me feel probably like the players that I just showed you and the fans, but that reduction in serotonin and testosterone. And so what I'd like you to do is sort of think about what are some of the physical or painful experiences that you might have encountered in your pursuit of failure or in your journey where you have undoubtedly failed leading up to this very moment in time. And one way we can sort of think about that, so if you really can think, I'd like you to actually try and come up with one very clear example in your mind of where you failed. So something that you can almost still feel that physical reaction to. And then this is actually just taken from the lecture that I did where everyone had this image and they just drew or colored on the image of the body so that they could sort of identify or visualize the physical reactions to failure that they would experience in their body. So you can do this now as we're talking, or you can do this later on and take another different example, or maybe take several different examples and then color using colors that feel appropriate for you to identify particular physical reactions you might experience. Just to give you an idea of what I sometimes feel when I feel failure, I really feel like my chest has been crushed. I feel like a pit at the bottom of my stomach. Heavy, knees weak. Just like kind of wanting to flop, and really just like a falling down type experience in all physical ways. So you might experience that as well. There's lots of different experiences, and by no means are anyone right or wrong. But a lot of these physical experiences remind us that failure is actually a threat. And what failure does when we encounter failure is that it's a threat to our ego, it's a threat to our identity, it's a threat to all of the things that we've used to build up to be the person who we are. And a lot of times the failures that hurt the most, physically hurt the most, are the ones that crush our identity or somehow shake or shatter how we see ourselves. So one of the ones that I had recently was I received some bad teaching evaluations. And of course, I care a lot about teaching. I want to do a good job, and I really want students to learn. And so to hear someone say that, I was the worst professor ever really shatters my identity, and I can feel all those physical experiences, or many of them at the very least. So when we think of failure as being a physical reaction and a physical reaction to threat, then it instantly brings to mind this idea of our sympathetic nervous system. So a division of our autonomic nervous system that responds to threats. And how we typically respond to threat is with a fight or flight response. So we either want to run away or we either want to fight. And all of those experiences are associated with very, very true physiological responses. So this is a reminder for some of you, but increased blood flow to the brain, we become hypervigilant, we have an increased production of epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, so really energizing type neurochemicals. Our pupils dilate so that we can have a very strong, good vision for what's in our focus. Our heart rate increases so that we can move the blood around and mobilize our muscles. Our breathing is faster and deeper so we can bring that oxygen in and circulate it through our blood system. We have adrenal hormones that are being released, our digestive system slows, and our blood pressure increases as well. So we end up with all of these experiences, and as many of you know, these physical reactions are experienced by each of us differently. Some we feel a little bit more intensely, and some we don't feel quite as much. But essentially, each of those are going to be present. So these physical reactions are part of the nervous system. So they're very much a part of what we experience, and it helps us guide future behavior. So in a lot of ways, these physical reactions are part of a feedback system. So it alerts us that something has changed in our environment, something negative is there, and that we need to react and change as a result. So in a lot of ways, we can start to think about all of those negative sensations as a feedback mechanism that teaches us that, okay, we failed and now we need to move on. So as we think about failure from a feedback perspective, I want to remind you of some of the experiences that we've had that are founded on this idea of getting feedback. So this image of the child beginning to walk is such a prime example of how failure and feedback are necessary in order for us to continue on. With this particular example, or just even think back to last time you saw a child beginning to walk. If the child never attempted to walk in the first place, then it would never have learned to fail and then readjust its behavior so that it can take a better step in the future, and then an even better step in that future after that. And then continually the child learns to walk. It learns to navigate through its environment, it learns its balance, it learns how to place its foot, and each of those are an adjustment from a failure from the previous attempt or attempts previous to those ones that existed. And I like this Chinese proverb, failure is not falling down but refusing to get up, as another way of sort of exemplifying that we need to fail in order to go forward, in order to get up again. And then just one interesting study, or something that we know from some scientific studies, is that failed tests and incorrect guesses can lead to future successes when followed immediately with feedback. And how this finding was discovered was by providing students, or participants in the study actually, with content. So they would be either given a passage, a text passage to read, and then were tested on that passage, or they were just given a test directly. So the test was testing information that they had never learned before. And when you compare these two groups, what you see is that the group where the individuals didn't receive the text and just had to guess on their answers of this like fictitious information and then received feedback, they did better in the future at remembering the content than the individuals who actually just studied a passage of text from the first place. So putting this into something a little bit more practical, imagine that you are trying to learn a new skill, or you're trying to learn something, say, a new software program on the computer. Well, if you read all of the text and all of the how-to manuals and then you're tested on it later versus just starting to dabble with it, making mistakes, and then figuring out how to navigate that software, the results are likely that you'll remember better by just trial and error than if you started to read from the very beginning. So failure can actually create better retention on memory tests. And this is really important when we think about why failure is so important, and we need to have it, and it's an important part of who we are. There's another interesting study that I read that was looking at how individuals were mimicking a motor behavior. So basically what they had was a ball of some sort, and they were trying to throw it in an arc that was mimicking another arc that they were looking at. And what they found was that there were some participants in the study who were completely variable. Their throws were all over the map. Like, it's as if they had no idea what they were doing. And when you separated that group of people from the people who mimicked the arc a little bit better at the beginning, they found that those who had the most variability actually performed the best in the end and were better able to mimic the arc. So replicate the motor movement that was expected of them. What the authors concluded was that the variability was actually important in refining their success in their motor performance in the end. It was as if the brain takes into account this huge variability and then is able to say, okay, that's too much, this is too little, this is exactly where I want to be, and it sort of assesses all of the angles within that. Compared to someone who sort of stays within that safety zone. They actually don't get to expose themselves to all of the whole spectrum of success that's present there. So I thought that was particularly interesting, especially when you think about, kids who have lots of variability and you think, oh my goodness, I don't know what they're doing, or, me teaching ultimate and watching people, like, they're throwing and it's just all over the map. But it gives me a new perspective that those people with the most variability might actually be more successful in the end. So we can think of our brain then as being designed to help us get back, adjust, and alter future behaviors. And there's several pieces of evidence that suggest that our brain is designed to take into consideration what we've done, adjust, and then alter future behaviors. Here's an example from EEG, so electroencephalograph research, where we actually can look at brain waves. So the top image is just an image of an individual wearing a head cap that is going to be monitoring the electrical activity within the brain. And you can monitor several different waveforms and look at what's happening when someone is experiencing something. So in this next slide, we see the data of individuals who have experienced an error in their reaction time or in their guesses. So essentially, the task would be something where they had to have their fingers pressing on a button and they were supposed to respond with correct answers and then not respond when it was an incorrect answer. This spike that the arrow is pointing at is actually reflective of something we call an error-related potential, or error-related brain spike, we'll just call it. And we see this happening when someone notices that they have made an error. So that's an incorrect response. So someone was going along doing a task, and then all of a sudden they made an incorrect response. So it could have been they were adding, let's say they were adding every number up by 7, and then all of a sudden they hit an error, and then there might be a spike that would be associated with that error, assuming that they actually noticed that they had an error. So what's interesting about this particular spike is that it shows that it's present when there's an error, and it's absent when there's no error. So that's interesting in and of itself. The brain has a natural mechanism to detect error. But it's not just a detection system. It's actually an adjustment system as well. Because what we know is that the level of that spike, so how high that spike is, actually predict success on future trials. So the more you have a spike, the more likely you are to be successful the next time you encounter that same situation. So we refer to this error-related brain spike as a detection and adjustment system, a neurological detection and adjustment system. And if we then go a little bit deeper and look at where is this actually originating, what parts of the brains are contributing to this error detection and adjustment system, we see two areas come up quite strongly. The one on the left-hand side is known as the cingulate cortex. And it's an area of the brain that is highly involved in aspects of our experience like awareness and goals. So kind of like checking in with your goals and knowing that you are moving towards your goals. So it's kind of like an awareness of where we are at this moment, who we are, and the alignment of what we might be seeking. So the cingulate cortex gets activated in those types of situations. It also seems to be one of the sources that generates that particular spike, so that it is processing this error versus correct response. The other area is known as the medial prefrontal cortex, and this is indicated at the very front of the brain in the green, actually, or the teal color. And the medial prefrontal cortex is involved in a lot of different experiences, including emotionality, but it's also been known to be involved in self-monitoring. And the self-monitoring is particularly interesting because if you think about a detection system, an error detection and adjustment system, we need something that is monitoring how we're actually doing. And so the medial prefrontal cortex seems to be the area that might be involved in that. Okay, so just a reminder then that one way we can think about failure is that there's neurofeedback, positive or negative, and that this neurofeedback helps us alter future actions, thoughts, and feelings. And again, as I said at the very beginning when we started this, it seems clear that our brain is designed to fail. You know, as a neuroscientist myself, it is absolutely clear that we have things in place where we fail and we learn from that failure, and that allows us to succeed. And so trying to get rid of failure doesn't seem like a solution. What we need to do is sort of look at the other side of it. So our ego or our mind doesn't seem to be as happy with failure. So we're going to talk a little bit about the psychology of failure, and what I'm going to do is ask you to do a little bit of reflection on your own mind's reaction to threat. So again, you can do this now, or you can do this a little bit later if you'd like, but maybe just even take a quick moment to think back to that failure example that you might have brought up at the very beginning of this talk, and then think about what were your mind's reactions to that particular threat. So when I think about my experience with the teaching evaluations, I had several mind reactions to threat, and I can get quite elaborate with my reactions. It can be, well, then I'm just going to quit. I'm not going to do that. And they don't understand me anyway. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, they weren't listening. They weren't paying attention. They weren't working hard enough. So I start to blame other people. Or I start blaming myself. I'm not good enough. I should quit. I should find a new job. What am I thinking? So there's lots of different mind reactions to failure that show up. Angry, frustrated, lonely, helpless, pointless, worried, blame, defeated. There's probably other ones that you might have experienced that aren't here, that you capture in a slightly different way. But these are happening, and these are the parts that are actually particularly troublesome. The failure itself is not actually a problem. It's how we react to that failure. It's particularly a problem if it keeps us from getting up again and then ultimately succeeding. So one way we can think about what to do with this particular experience is to mind the gap. And what I mean by the gap is the area between the brain, the body, and the mind. So earlier we talked about the experience of failure on our body. So what are the body sensations? What are the physical sensations that are associated with failure? And then there's this gap in between before we get to these defensive reactions. So any of those words that I already put up, guilt, anger, blame, self-criticism, avoidance, a fix-it mentality, anger, laughter, there's a variety of different things that we can experience. But the opportunity to mind the gap really has to do with the fact, first of all, the awareness that there is a space between those physical reactions and then those defensive or mental reactions. Those mental reactions aren't actually being produced as a result of the failure. There's a time lag there. If we recognize that the physiology of failure is uncomfortable and unpleasant and devastating and hurtful, we can also recognize that those same experiences will not last forever. It has to change. Serotonin that might drop or the testosterone that might drop will eventually come back to baseline. Eventually, if we have a success, it'll even go higher than baseline. But those experiences, that headache, the heart racing, all of those experiences, those physical experiences associated with stress, don't last forever. They naturally start to move away. And if we can spend time in that space and have awareness of those negative experiences and try not to fix them or move away from them or avoid those experiences, then we actually can stand in that space longer, and we may not even have those defensive reactions that happen as a result of that. We might not need those anymore because they serve no purpose. We're letting the physical reactions just move on their own. So a big takeaway is that the physiology, the body sensations do not have to equal the mental sensations, the defensive reactions, the attempt to protect our ego. Those do not have to equal each other. Strategies for how to deal with that gap or to mind the gap include, first and foremost, awareness, recognition, and reflection. So being able to become aware when you've experienced a failure and what your immediate physiological reactions are, to recognize those physiological reactions, reflect upon them, and even just stay present with those and experience those for what they are. If you're particularly skilled at this, you can even observe for them long enough to see how they'll naturally dissipate. Eventually then, if we can do that, we start to disconnect from our automatic and our learned responses against failure from the actual failure itself. So all of those responses, I might have a biological, natural reaction to failure with the, error-related spike and, my medial prefrontal cortex and my cingulate cortex being activated, but that doesn't mean that I naturally have to say I am no longer a good person or that I should quit or any of those things. That's a separate piece. So eventually, with the practice of minding that gap, then we can disconnect those automatic responses, biological responses, from what we've now learned as the mental responses to that. We can also seek to get more positive feedback than negative feedback. So recognizing that the negative or the constructive criticism that we might get might be a little bit difficult for our mind to hold, then one of the reactions we can do is solicit positive feedback in a particular environment. And again, practicing mindfulness is essentially the strategy that is being offered here to mind that gap. We can also start to reframe what we've experienced so that it is less difficult for our ego to perceive, and especially if it moves us from a place of inaction or stagnation into a place of action. And so one way of just thinking about this is reframing some of the phrases. So after I received my evaluations, I could say, I'm a failure, and experience a very pessimistic way of receiving that feedback. So recognizing it as very permanent. I feel as if I'm a failure forever. Personal, I am a failure. It's not just my actions, it's the entire being of me is a failure, and that being pervasive. So everything that I do is a failure. We can contrast that to a different way of looking at it, and a more optimistic way of experiencing a failure, and saying, shifting it from being very permanent and personal and pervasive to something that is a little bit more at a distance. So that particular strategy that I used in the classroom didn't work out the way I expected, but I learned a lot about it, and as a result, I adjusted for my next time, and changed the way the curriculum was delivered, or changed the way the students were interacting with the curriculum, so that they could experience something the way I was intending them to. So recognizing that their intent, my intent, wasn't received as well. So those are just some of the strategies that that we can work with, and I guess just a reminder of what we learned about. So first of all, failure is physical, painful, and uncomfortable, and in no way would I suggest that it's not. There's biochemical reactions that happen that are associated with that, and those are very real. But recognizing that despite that, failure is a neurofeedback. It's a feedback mechanism that's designed to help us succeed in the future. And if we fall down or refuse to get up, then we don't get to use this very important system that is going to help us reach the success we want in the future. Also recognizing that we have a mind reaction, or a mind's way of reacting, or an ego's way of reacting to the threat against us when we experience that failure. And we can acknowledge all of those things, but we can also recognize that the physical sensations that are very negative and the sensations that we're trying to move away from are not the same as our defensive reactions to them. And so we can actually break that connection and mind that gap a little bit better, so that we are coming to a place where we can experience physical sensations and change our mental reactions into something that's more active, more proactive, more success-driven, rather than getting stuck in this mentality of failure. So, what did you learn today? Well, I hope that you learned that failure is natural, and that we should avoid trying to avoid it, and rather accept it as a gift, a biological gift, and embrace it for everything that it's worth, and use it to help us succeed in the future. And that's that for that. It's just a little quick overview of failure, but yeah, so.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mandy. That was really great. I don't see any questions there for you specifically on this, but certainly if you guys have questions when you're looking at it later, please indicate them in the comments below, and we will be monitoring that, and we'll respond to them as we are able to. Are you going to submit any of those worksheets as PDF for people to be able to work with as well?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I will do that.
Okay. Fantastic. A couple of things that I found super interesting, actually, just coinciding with an experience that I had yesterday, where I live stream gaming. And so yesterday I was trying to beat the final boss in a game, and of course it's being streamed live, so there's the added pressure of performance, much like you in sports. And so I thought it was really interesting, because I do notice, and other people probably in sports and in games can notice that, where you have that moment of awareness of like after you failed, you feel almost like a little bit more alert and more ready to like try a second attempt.
Yeah.
And so that made me think, like, do you think that there's any way to change that peak reaction, whether through like can it increase or decrease with repetition? Is there kind of a time period where like after a certain amount of time that kind of decreases, and so it might actually be beneficial to kind of step back and then retry?
So the peak of alertness is right after, and you're suggesting that's a positive experience, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's actually very much a physical reaction to stress, right? To reaction to a threat. So that is going to happen, and it is going to dwindle. So our alertness is going to not stay super high, because essentially when a stress reaction is happening, we are on alert. We're like, okay, where's the danger? Is there more danger? All these things are happening, and so at some point our brain's going to kick in and say, okay, there's no more danger, and you can walk away. But there is a period where that alertness is going to be there, and that you raise a really good point, because I've never thought of this, but I wonder if that is like the peak time to receive that feedback, because in the studies that I've read, receiving feedback almost immediately or as immediate as possible is the ideal time to form that learning. And so, we're not really learning like complex cognitive things, but that arousal that's part of that does facilitate our memory, and so that probably is part of what allows us to succeed in the future, because it becomes very salient. The pieces that are important become very salient, and then we adapt and proceed in the future as a result of that. So that's a really interesting personal experience, and I think that makes so much like neurobiological sense as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope that all of you guys have enjoyed watching this segment on failure and how that's interpreted in the brain and how it's a natural experience. And if you liked this video, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more Pop-Up Neuroscience. We do promise to continue these explorations into the reactions and actions in our brains. So I hope that you keep asking how does your brain work, and we will see you in another video soon.
Thank you.